Once you were old enough, what were the dark family secrets you were finally let in on? My father was married with another woman before meeting my mother. They had a daughter and my dad loved her so much his wife started going crazy jealous. My dad noticed some strange behavior she had towards the girl, and when he tried to talk to her about it she started arguing with him. He then left with his daughter to my uncle's house. She knew my dad would left the girl with my aunt while he was at work, so she called the police and said my aunt kidnapped her child. The police came in and took the girl away from my aunt. She immediately tried to call my dad, but the woman drove back home, put poison in her daughter's milk and forced her to drink it. When my dad arrived, he found his daughter already dead and left alone. The woman was never ever found. My dad had never had justice for his first child. Kinda sad. Then when I was born my mother didn't mind to name me after my sister. We share the same name, and that's actually how I found it out. I asked my parents about my name and they told me the whole story. That's so messed up and sad, and a lot of baggage for them to carry around. I am sorry, but I hope they cherish you and hope they don't put too much pressure on you because you share your late half-sister's name. Got a Facebook message from one guy asking if I was related to my dad, since it is not a common last name. I thought he was a fan of his work, because I was in college at the time and the guy was about the same age as me, and that is how I found out my dad slept around and that I had a half-brother the same age as me. When I was around 3-4, my aunt and her 3 sons came and lived with us for a few weeks. One night my mom stayed up and I found her downstairs sitting in a chair looking out the window. One day, my aunt and the boys moved and never came back. Turns out, she was going through a nasty divorce. She had the boys at the house with her while she was packing things one day, and her husband came home. He locked the boys in the room, stabbed her, and then shot himself. My mom had been staying up with a gun at night because she had seen him in our backyard earlier that night. Holy shit. Your mom is a ducking badass and I hope things got better. My grandfather killed his youngest brother to get out of going to Vietnam. He, his brother, and 2 of their friends had their numbers called in the draft for Vietnam. They didn't want to go, obviously, but they didn't come from money and all worked to support their families. If they got arrested they'd lose their jobs and their families would lose their income. So they decided on a different plan to get out of going. They would drive to get their medical checks together, and on the way there they would drive the car into a tree. The plan was to get too injured to get sent to war, but not so injured as to be permanently crippled. And it had to look like an accident so nobody got arrested. This was in country Western Australia, so they were all going to say they swerved to miss a kangaroo and hit the tree. My grandfather was driving, his friend was in the passenger seat, and the other 2 were in the back. His brother was behind the passenger seat. They hit the tree doing about 40 kph, enough to be serious. A broken leg for my grandfather, a broken arm for the guy behind him, and broken ribs all around. They definitely weren't going to war. The problem was that for maximum impact, and because this was rural Australia in the 60s, they weren't wearing seatbelts, and nobody found them or their car for an hour or so, and nobody considered internal injuries in this plan. And my grandfather's brother bled to death from a ruptured spleen in the back seat. He was dead before they got to a hospital. My grandfather never forgave himself, and he never talked about it. My grandma was the only one he ever told, as far as we know, and she didn't tell my mother and I until long after his death. We found a small box in their bedroom when we were cleaning out the house after she died last year. It had a clipping from the local newspaper at the time about the accident. It said that they had swerved to miss a route and called it a tragedy. I don't think my mother told any of her siblings, so technically this is still the family secret. I guess now you all in on it. I was told that my mother's older brother had died in an accident. He was intoxicated and got run over by a train. A whole bunch of unfortunate circumstances, etc. My grandmother often mentioned it with sadness, because she considered him a brilliant boy, very handy and had a hopeful career in arts. He was a teenager when he died. However, every time this story came up, my mother's face hardened and she never spoke about it herself. I could kinda sense that there was something left unsaid, but I was a kid, so I did not really question the story. My mom finally confided in me about a year ago that she was sexually abused by her brother and that it was not an accident, but a suicide. My grandmother has no idea. My grandparents ran a boys' home in the 60s and 70s, for kids with unsafe living situations, abusive family, juvenile criminal records, etc. It was well run and they provided the kids with a good life. My mum was an only child and grew up living around them. When I was small and asked her about it, she would say that for the larger part she loved growing up around them because it was like having friends all the time. In the pictures that exist of her from that time, she looks like a little boy herself. She refused to wear girls' clothes and had a boy's haircut. But in all of these photos of her, throughout her childhood and adolescence, there is a strange sad energy in her face that I couldn't put my finger on. Even though she is smiling, I could just feel it when I saw those pictures. I didn't understand how she would describe these times as so fun and happy. But when my grandma would say she had heard from one of the boys around Christmas, Easter or birthdays, my mum would go quiet and look close to tears, and maybe stay this way for a day or so. My mum was an extremely overprotective mother when I was a teen. At 14 I wasn't allowed to shave my legs, pluck my eyebrows, wear anything that wasn't learner bra. Nothing terrible, but it felt like I was being kept as a child. At 15 I rebelled a bit and my mum clamped down even harder. She would emphasize over and over that boys were not to be trusted. They only want one thing: girls that give off certain messages to them will come a cropper. The horrible twist is that I was assaulted by men on 2 separate occasions in my teens, and when I told her, she basically said to me, "I told you so." I went through therapy a bit later, and managed to process that these things weren't my fault, and that my mother's logic had made things worse. I confronted her with this: those events were not my fault. It was nobody's fault but the perpetrator. I did not do anything that invited assault. She really could not accept this. It had to be my fault in some way. When I went to the police to make a historical report, she was extremely awkward and unsupportive. My dad stepped in to help me during this time. 2 years later, during an argument, my mum tells me that she was molested, groomed and assaulted from the age of 6 by 2 separate boys in their early adolescence who were living at the home. She didn't realize anything about this was wrong until her father saw something happening to her, blamed her, implied she caused it to happen, told her mother, said it must not happen again. My mum was 8. Nothing happened to the boys, who had likely been sexually abused themselves. The home carried on working for years and no one said anything more about it. When my mum told me this, I just held her and told her it wasn't her fault, that her parents should have protected her when they knew that was happening, that she should have been better cared for. When she told me, I felt no shock. It felt like I had always known. The sad feeling I could see in those pictures of my mum when she was little, and how she had so desperately tried to protect me from growing up, suddenly all made sense. Not very much a secret, but took me until I was older to understand what was happening. My mom would sometimes have us play a game called Army, which consisted of me, my mom, and my siblings army crawling around our apartment, kind of a hide-and-seek style game. She would yell, "Hit the deck," randomly, and we would all drop and find a hiding spot. We would giggle and giggle while my mom army crawled around looking for us. We loved the game so much. I realized a few years ago while retelling the story that we lived in a really terrible neighborhood, and she would yell it out when she heard gunshots outside the building. I am assuming she was worried about stray bullets. Edit: I shared everyone's amazing comments with my mom, and she shed a tear. She feels very appreciated on International Women's Day today. My grandmother tried to murder my grandfather when she got sick of him beating the shit out of her every day. She swung an axe at him and he blocked it with his hand and lost his thumb. She left him before I was born. Mine is more cool than horrifying on the sense I am proud of this one. My grandfather was an amazing guy. He was a sniper paratrooper in World War II. Always refused to talk about the army. I learned later that he was dishonorably discharged after injury. Turns out the sergeant in his squad was an absolute bastard. He had to go behind enemy lines to set a post up, and the plane was flying too low for a safe jump. He protested it to the sergeant, who proceeded to shove him out of the plane after calling him a coward. Both my grandfather and his spotter partner were seriously injured in the landing. His partner never knew him, was paralyzed and lost a leg. My grandfather broke both of his arm, hand, and some ribs. They both were rescued shortly after and taken to a military hospital. That's not what got him discharged, though. Turns out the sergeant showed up to visit them in the infirmary, and my grandfather punched him square inches the face with his only good hand twice. If his only army buddy we ever knew is to be believed, he was also visiting at the time he floored the bastard. After that, and on top of his injuries, the army sent him home for the rest of the war. We found out later after he passed, and we had to go through his stuff, a bunch of newspaper and article clippings about the folks involved he had kept. The sergeant was also discharged after a similar incident cost the lives of 2 other members of his squad a year later that weren't so lucky. The man apparently drunk himself to death years later. We found all these written but unsent letters to his sergeant. We found photos of my grandfather's squad and the 2 that died with him. It was heartbreaking. I never knew any of this. He was such a fun, kind, and goofy guy. You'd never think anything like this would happen to him. Now I knew why my parents always said never to bring the army around him. Miss you, Grandpa. I'd have punched the bastard too. When I was about 10, my cousin and his dad died. I always thought it was an accident, and on the same day, when I was old enough, I was told that his dad actually committed suicide, and my cousin followed him couple months later. Truly devastated me, although I didn't know them well. When I was young, I thought it was really nice that my nana lived with my aunt and her family, since she was getting on a bit and it meant she was looked after and there were always people around. Aunt has 6 kids. Occasionally aunt would gripe about being the one looking after nana, since aunt is also one of many kids, and being young I sympathized, but given they all spent loads of time with nana too, did not think it was a big deal. You do not think about financial responsibility when you were young, I think, just social and caring. Well, it turns out the reason Nana lives with Aunt is because Aunt and her husband convinced Nana to put the house in their name so they could look after her affairs, and sold it out from under her and invested the money in a pyramid scheme, so it is gone now. Because of this, her siblings refuse to give Aunt a penny towards looking after Nana, since it is her fault Nana has no money or assets, and instead pay to take Nana out all the time. Meals, shopping, activities, so she does not go without, but they let Aunt struggle under the weight of Nana's general living expenses. Aunt's kids are all independent now, so they are not going to be impacted by money problems. Now I look back at her griping with annoyance and think what a terrible person she is. That my cousin was actually my half-brother. Mom got pregnant in college and my aunt and uncle adopted him. And that my dad was not my biological father. Mom and dad got divorced. She got pregnant by another man, and my dad was not able to have kids of his own, so they got remarried and he raised me as his own. My grandmother was in a very abusive relationship since she was 17. Since her then boyfriend was an alcoholic and forced himself drunk on my grandmother several times, she got pregnant, and since that was not done in the 50s, they had to get married as soon as possible. After their first child, they ended up having 4 more kids. One didn't survive childbirth, but the other 3 lived. During this time, my grandmother's husband was still an alcoholic and very, very abusive. She had to literally flee away from him, from her family, to survive. She would definitely ended up dead if she didn't. She also met my grandfather during this time, and they fell in love. She left her kids with her mother, who had custody of the kids anyways. That's how they rolled back then. My grandfather sold the only thing he had, which was a small moped, so he could help her escape her husband. Many, many years later, when my grandma had divorced her husband, married my grandpa, had 3 more kids with him, grandkids etc. and moved back to the hometown. They also had reconnected with her first 4 daughters, and everything was going well, except for one thing. It was a tiny town. Everybody knows everybody over there, and rumors spread fast. And there was a rumor about my grandmother from back in the days of her first husband. The rumor was that she had some sort of fling with another man in town, not my grandpa, and one of her first 4 daughters was his. The daughters didn't know about this until they asked my grandma about it, and she was flabbergasted. Told them it wasn't true at all, that it definitely didn't happen, and that this should be the end of it. It didn't sit right with the daughters. So they did a DNA test, and then the results came in. There it was, proof that the gossip wasn't actually gossip, but it was true. Daughter number 3 was a half-sister of the other 3, so they went to my grandmother again. They showed her the proof. It said very clearly that one of them wasn't their fathers. My grandma denied again, even tough they had it black on white that it was true. The daughters went no contact with my grandmother after this. They never got over the fact that she left them in the first place, and this betrayal was the straw that broke the camel's back. Can't he really blame them for that? Still, to this day she claims it didn't happen and that all 4 women are from the same man. Hit like if you enjoyed this video. Consider subscribing to our channel.